Welcome to the fifth episode of Hey, We Need to Talk. There's a certain image that India has traditionally enjoyed at an international level, or put in another way, there's a certain manner in which India has positioned itself within the world order as a secular, plural, multi party democracy. But there's a sense of late that this is changing, that this image or this posturing, or in other words, how the world looks at India, is undergoing certain normative and structural shifts. Now, this is of course up for debate, but there are certain patterns that are discernible, which says that the way India does diplomacy or the way India interacts with the world is undergoing some kind of alteration. And the sense is that this is not for the better, this is for the worse. But again, this is something that what we are going to discuss today. And for that, I have with me two very special guests. I have Shubhangi Agarwalla, who's a final year student at NLU Delhi, and she works on critical international law and also runs a blog called International Law in the Global South. I also have with me Prannv Dhawan, who's a fourth year student at NLS Bangalore, and he's also the founding editor of Law School Policy Review. He's currently interning at the Bombay High Court, and both of them have very closely worked on issues of international affairs and India's international image and how India fits within the global world order. Welcome, Shubhangi and Pranav.
Hey, hi, Angshuman.
I'm going to begin with two specific events that happened in the last 2 months. Earlier in September, at the end of September, Amnesty International India decided to close down their office in Bangalore, stating that they are being hounded by the government on the basis of certain tax laws or foreign funding laws. Then in October, the UN Human Rights Chief, Michelle Bachelet, she made a statement saying that India has been using certain laws to go after foreign NGOs and other organizations that receive foreign funding within the development sector, and also been using draconian laws such as the UAPA to go after dissidents and political activists, right? And to which the Ministry of External Affairs shot back with a very stern reply, with a very harsh reply, in which it said that India is a democratic polity based on rule of law and an independent judiciary. And more critically, it said that violation of law cannot be condoned under the pretext of human rights. And a more informed view of the matter was expected of a UN body, is how New Delhi put it. But this is not the first time that our foreign ministry is responding to a statement from the UN with such strong words. In fact, I would say this has been the trend in the last 2-3 years. Particularly, I have noticed a shift in the way the world, particularly the Western world, perceives the Narendra Modi government since the abrogation of Article 370 last year, August. There were some limited amount of criticism that the Modi government was receiving from external quarters before that. However, particularly in 2014, when the government came to power, I would say it was seen more or less favorably, even by Western liberal governments and Western liberal media. But progressively, things got worse for the Modi government, and I would say after August 2019, that is the abrogation of Article 370 in Kashmir and the lockdown that the government imposed in Kashmir, the noise from the external quarters became louder and louder with each day. Then we saw a delegation, a particularly unusual delegation of far-right members of European Parliament visit Kashmir. And immediately after that, we saw a congressional hearing centered on Kashmir in the US, during which India was critically apprehended. Indian policies in Kashmir were critically apprehended. So my question to both of you is, do you think there has been a shift at all in how the world or the Western liberal media looks at the Modi government or looks at India currently under this regime? And if there is a shift, what kind of shift do you think has it been?
So, every time someone brings this up, I feel like there's a standard answer that's expected that you have these documents by international NGOs and the UNHCR on how the Modi regime is fascist and violating principles of international law, and this translates into a diplomatic mess. But in my opinion, the situation is a bit more complex than that. And I'll give you like several reasons for why I think so. I think the first being, I mean, since like I think my primary interest is regarding critical international law, right? So I'm coming from that positionality. And I think the first has to do with how we define authoritarianism and fascism in international law. I'll give you an example. For example, if you Google if is Modi a fascist, you'll see a variety of reports and op-eds and editorial pieces, uh, which all come to different conclusions. And I think the striking thing about this is not the fact that there's the sheer volume of conversation that's happening, but the fact that every commentator seems reluctant to come down hard either way, and they either settle for something along the lines of like it's almost fascist, barely fascist, or not yet, right? And when you think about it, it's not really hard to make sense of this ambivalence, mostly because most of these commentators use the same narrow range of case studies in order to generate their definition of what fascism entails, which is basically Hitler's Germany or Mussolini's Italy, thereby completely excluding the global south from the general history of fascism. And I think this has a very uh, obvious real world consequence, because what this results, this ambiguity that's generated, actually creates uh, the possibility of other state leaders and other uh, actors in the international fora to absolve responsibility, because there's complete ambiguity on whether this actually constitutes as an authoritarian regime or fascism, because we're relying upon European case studies and European definitions of what this entails. So that's one thing where I think uh, which I think we must consider when we're talking about how the world is viewing India currently. But also the second thing is, I think we tend to think that international law and fascism are both incompatible. And there's this common idea that fascism first attacked international law and was eventually defeated by it at the end of Second World War. But I think this assumption is deeply misleading, because both fascism and international law have colonial origins. And in fact, if you look at classical international law, uh, what might be surprising to many people who are not familiar with international law is that international law is neutral towards regime types. What this means is that the purpose of international law was to facilitate interaction between states regardless of the kind of government a state has. Of course, in the 1990s, with the human rights movement, you see a push to a more democratic international law. But I think now scholars are coming to terms with the fact that the human rights regime and the liberal order uh, didn't benefit as many people as we were initially led to believe it did, right? Because it's often tethered to open markets, which are not suitable for erstwhile colonies like India, which are kept at an inherent disadvantage. So I was also like recently I was also reading a paper by Tom Ginsberg, who's a professor at the University of Chicago, who gave a really mind-boggling statistic, which is that less than half of the world is living in full democracies or flawed or even flawed democracies. So I think the question then becomes, who are we referring to when we talk about how the international community views India? Even formally progressive states such as the United States, which ostensibly had a very liberal agenda that it promoted the world over, has recently voted against the United Nations resolution that condemns the glorification of Nazism, which you would assume is a very basic thing, that you would assume that the international community can gain consensus over. And I think another example would be, like, just last year there was an effort to condemn China for for its policies in Xinjiang, where there's a crackdown on Muslims. But after a debate in the international community, a massive majority of states voted with China to defend its human rights record, including Muslim countries such as Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, or Iraq. So I think what it goes to show is that a fractured multilateral framework is the order of the day. And uh, even like, I think the most striking thing about this is that even though we're living in a global pandemic, when you would have assumed that there would be a collective search for a solution, we're just not seeing it, right? So I think it sounds really cynical, but I think the international community's reaction to India is not, and probably will not be, as pronounced as one might expect it to be.
Right. That's a very interesting point about also about how you talked about that how international law was never actually designed to counter any authoritarian or fascist regimes, despite the coming of a more democratic international legal regime, let's say in the 90s in the post-Cold War era. I'll come to that point later, but Pranav, what do you think? Has the way India is seen by the world, or has the way the international order, the world order views India, has that changed over the past half a decade or so?
I think the way India looks at itself has itself changed. So a large part of how the India's image makeover at a global level has changed. Image makeover has happened is a function of what has happened in India, and I do agree with Shubhangi that we cannot expect a lot of reprisal from the international powers or the fractured multilateral order that we have, or even or even expect something to expect this to be something like a new normal or something radically different from the past. But one thing which is very different is precisely in terms of how India views itself, and I would like to demonstrate it by saying uh, how when the Indian constitution was founded, or how when the Indian nation was founded, there was a lot of idealistic internationalism in our approach to the world. And there was an approach towards world peace, there was an approach towards world diplomacy. And the way India saw itself was as a as a willful participant in a global world order which was based on rules. And when we see the and there have been a lot of cracks in it. When we look at the situation in Kashmir in 1990s, when we look at the situation in other border districts in the country at various points of time, we do see a lot of problems in that. But India has, I think, the new thing that has happened today is that India is not really as concerned about its international image, and it is rethinking its own image. And what we see in the current external affairs, Mr. Jaishankar's statements after some international organization or a government which doesn't support the Kashmir policy, or some senators in US, they make a critical statement. The way India approaches it is not by justifying. India approaches it by saying, okay, yes, we have done it, and you deal with it. And there is a sense in the statement that we as a nation are changing ourselves, and the world should start to deal with us on new terms. Now that leads, in my opinion, to a very confusing maze of international. It's like, I think it leads us to a confusing maze of international engagements, wherein you have a bunch of countries where India has shared interest, but those shared interests are affected because of certain core points of the domestic policy in India. For example, if the domestic politics in India wanted to otherize Muslims when the pandemic started, then a number of Muslim countries and other countries from which we had so many foreign tourists who are attending a religious congregation, they were, one would say, irregularly and extra constitutionally not just put in and not just isolated but also arrested, and they continue to be arrested. And there are some provincial court orders which are letting them go, and there are orders which are questioning government high-handed. But the statement that is sent to the world is one that India's domestic commitment to a rule-based order has reduced. And I think that has led us to a situation where, while the world itself is trying to deal with this fractured multilateral international order. In India itself is dealing with these contestations in a way that is probably not in its best interest.
Right. So the sense is that if we assume that there's a normative change in which India deals with the world or the world deals with India, then that's because there are normative changes happening at home. The fundamental character of the country or the fundamental character of the Indian polity or the Indian Republic is undergoing shifts. But within that, there is a gray area that there is a certain kind of decoupling between of the events that are undergoing or the ideology that's being propelled at home and the ideology that's being propelled at a global scale. For instance, we still see our diplomats, we still see the Indian diplomatic establishment taking a quote-unquote liberal stance in global bodies. We have seen India making very pro-refugee and pro-migrant arguments. Sorry, hang on, I'll say that again. We have seen India make very pro-refugee and pro-migrant arguments at a global level, particularly during the meetings and conferences of the Global Compact on Refugees and the Global Compact on Migrants. We have also seen India not abandon the multilateral framework, in fact, proactively push for global multilateralism. It even joined the certain alliance of multilateralism that was created by Germany last year. So unlike the Trump administration in the US, which has, let's say, pulled itself out of the Paris Accord, UNESCO and WHO, India hasn't done any such thing. So there is a sense that India wants to completely separate or distinguish its the Modi government wants to completely distinguish its ideological dispensation or its ideological outlook at home and what it does at a global scale. Now this is of course because the space for maneuver for a country like India, for a middle power like India at a global scale, is much smaller than a space that a country like the United States has. So it's under compulsion to project a liberal point of view in a world that is still predominantly liberal, that still predominantly follows a liberal framework, in order to remain a part of that world order, which India definitely wants to. What do you think, Shubhangi?
Absolutely. I think Pranav made a really interesting point that also ties in with what you've just said, which is that there's a complete lack of justification that's being provided by the Indian government, which is surprising because even states which inherently don't agree with international law, such as China, made sophisticated legal arguments during the South China Sea arbitration. And then you have India, where during the Balakot strikes, just saying that they're conducting a non-military preemptive strike with no legal basis. So I think there's also this question of how do you even analyze something like that when India is not even bothering to justify its actions. But on the same note, I think what is really interesting, particularly with regard to the CAA riots, is that India is actually adopting the language of international humanitarian law in order to propagate its own anti-Muslim rhetoric. Just for some background, the CAA amendment created an exemption from the illegal migrants category for persons who are Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, Jain, Parsis, Christians from 3 Muslim majority countries. But what the government has said, it's in its response affidavit at the court, is that India is the sole rational and logically feasible place in South Asia for refugees to make an asylum claim. And it also says that it wants to protect people from persecution. So you see how it's continuously using the logic of international humanitarian law, but in a very counterintuitive sense. And I think another thing that's very interesting is that by singling out only Muslim countries as opposed to like Buddhist Myanmar or even the Tamils in Sri Lanka, I think what India is doing is it's engaging in exceptional persecution which the government then equates with religious persecution. And this sort of discourse, which paints Muslim states as barbaric, in contrast to like the secular and compassionate India, is an essential aspect of Hindutva ideology, which, like, if you see, it follows the savage victim and savior narrative, which is of something that scholars who are critical of human rights discourse regularly invoke when talking about how to critique human rights discourse, because it's the same sort of logic that colonial states imposed upon their colonies. So I think this is a very interesting shift where India, despite being a post colony, is actually invoking the language of a colonial state uh, to perversely use humanitarian principles of refugee law and construct Muslim states as savage, whose victims have to be protected by the Hindutva state.
Right. That is very fascinating. It actually goes down to the core ideological motivation behind something like the CAA. There is simultaneously there is also the narrative that's attached to the CAA is that India is a natural homeland of Hindus. So any Hindu from one of these quote unquote persecuted environments in this Muslim majority country, if they want to look for refuge, if they want to look for a permanent home, they might as well come to India. It's almost like the Zionist argument for Israel. And it's interesting how India frames it at a global context. What do you say about this, Pranav? And also, if you could talk a bit about what I said earlier in terms of is India trying to pitch itself as still being a liberal power or still being a liberal country, which has been its sort of USP or its connecting link with the West for the longest time, but doing something very contradictory or or following a very opposite ideology back at home.
So when I was listening to Shubhangi speak, one thing came to my mind was that Indian secularism, since its very inception, has been viewed by many as this Hindu attempt at multiculturalism. And there is a lot of attachment of this benevolent Hindu or majoritarianism. And I think while that benevolence has certainly gone away, and while we do see a sort of punitive nature in that ideology, especially the ideology that we've got, I think what goes at the heart of the liberalism or illiberalism of our regime is the question of who determines and takes and appropriates these labels. And if you talk about appropriating Ambedkar, Buddha, Gandhi, and making Yoga Day the big thing, and talking a lot about the welfare work in India. So India is certainly making a lot of PR moves globally, and certainly trying to also co-opt the liberal space by saying that this is how India determines, or the current regime determines, liberalism, and that this is that according to them is a more genuine definition of liberalism. And this is especially true in the context of how the moves in Kashmir are being defined. I mean, we see a lot of diplomatic confusion here, because when the queer rights agenda in the UNHRC is debated, India doesn't vote in favor or it defers. But when we talk about Kashmir, the first thing that the government says abroad is that it is going to help the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, is going to help India's peers, because the Supreme Court verdicts will get extended there, and it will help women. So we do see a very maximalist approach, if you allow me to call it, wherein India wants to wherein our regime wants to co-opt every tag that it can, while falling short of many of them, and while falling short of that whole temperament that is there in international diplomacy of engaging with the other side, of justifying your side, of demonstrating your commitment, because a sectarian law like CAA is anything but secular. But what we see in the benevolent justifications for it is an attempt at a liberal attempt to co-opt the secular space. So there is certainly a lot of confusion that is there, and I think what we need to look out for is how does this pan out with the state of the world today. If we look at we are living in a post-liberal international economic order world, wherein all countries are both internally divided and even the mediums for multilateral engagement are divided. So how does India engage with this is something that is very, it should be very fascinating. And I hope there is some degree of coherence towards the national interest in these contexts.
Right. There is, I think it also comes down to what liberalism actually means within a domestic context and within an international context. I think there's some sort of normative difference in how that term is understood. In a more domestic political context, let's say in the Indian context, liberalism might mean affirmative action towards minorities, greater human rights, and sort of greater political and civil rights. But then again, when we talk about the international order, let's say India's participation in the Quad and India seeking a more rules-based sort of free and open Indo-Pacific, for instance. There is also that sense that kind of liberalism, or that kind of creation of a liberal international order, and India leading that order, at least within the region, can happen simultaneously while the government installs a more sectarian domestic regime. So there is that level of separation, or the kind of separation that's been engineered, right? And I think at the heart of it is exactly this. A public relations strategy at an international level, right? Because India cannot afford to project itself as a Puritan ethnic majoritarian state or a sectarian state within a liberal order, within an international order that's still predominantly liberal, right? All right. So what I'm actually always curious to know when I think about this, these recent push and pulls between India and the international community, there's a lot of talk about in international circles that there are pushbacks to the Indian democratic order, or the Indian liberal democratic order. Then we have seen very critical statements from the UN. There was a statement, very strong report on Kashmir in 2018 from the OHCHR, to which India actually shot off with a particularly harsh response. India even talked about, quote unquote, personal prejudices seeping into the report, and it was not so subtly referring to the OHCHR's apparently personal prejudices against India. So it came out as a very jarring response from MEA, where and OHCHR was also accused of pro-Pakistan bias. Then 2 years later, we saw the USCIRF, the Commission on International Religious Freedom, bring out a very, very harsh report on India, where it in fact put India in the list of countries of particular concern, and even suggested sanctions against Indian leaders. The last time the USCIRF did that was during 2002, after the Gujarat riots, right? So we have seen some very, very strong statements from particularly within the UN framework against India. But what I always wondered is that what is the exact consequence or the ramification of these kind of statements on India's image in the world? Do they really have any adverse consequences, or are they really going to have any adverse consequences on India's image? Or do you believe that the manner in which the resilience that's built into the international system, where domestic markets, where neoliberal agendas dominate over human rights, principles of human rights, justice, or accountability, do you think those are going to compensate for the negative press or the bad press that India is getting from the international community? So I've always wondered, actually, will it actually harm India, all of these statements? What do you both think? Let's start with Pranav.
So Angshuman, I don't have a definite response on this, but I certainly think the way India was defined in a secular democratic order, and the way India's pre-2014, or one would say 1950 self-definition was, it does harm India in a very definitive way, in the sense that India's bargaining power in the world does reduce. When we look at the situation after India's engagement with the US, it was almost forced to send it.
Your voice was interrupted. Just say that.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, when we look at the India's engagement during the COVID pandemic with the US, we do see a situation where India was almost forced to send the HCQ medicine because Trump had asked. We also see a situation where at multiple levels, the European Union or other countries put human rights violations on the agenda when they meet state leaders. And all of that, I think, does in a way counteract India's bargaining power when it's maybe talking about some trade deals or some concessions or other strategic interests, and it does bring India's interest. Uh, it does make it a political issue in other domestic countries. Like the best example is US, where moment we have some Indian state leader going there, we have a lot of polarization in whether it should be engagement with them or not, who should engage, and even the Indian state leaders and their policies also tend to polarize them further. We saw what happened in the Trump rally that happened in both in US and in India. So how will I think because of this definition of India in sectarian, majoritarian, authoritarian terms, and the sort of bonhomie that the regime wants to establish with certain political leaders in certain countries, it does India a lot of disservice in material terms, and not just in terms of the bargaining power, but also the sort of buy-in that a lot of other political groups and institutions have in India. Because if India was really the India's prime minister was really the best friend of Trump, we wouldn't be seeing a report like USCIRF coming out from there. So I don't think it does harm India in material terms. If we talk about it in larger terms, I think India is a large market, so nobody is going to push the buttons in a very like nobody is going to be very categorical in it, but at some level it does reduce the bargaining power.
Right, but there could also be a counter argument that let's for a moment distinguish between the United States and the EU. Agreed, EU's human rights framework and the way EU privileges human principles of human rights, justice, and accountability, that remains, right. And EU has shown that in various cases, including in Myanmar's case, where it has applied some limited sanctions over the Rohingya crisis. So the EU case is still there. The EU liberal order case is still there. But on the United States particularly, there is also a sense that if the US administration, if the Trump administration itself doesn't believe in the global human rights regime, or itself is so dismissive of global human rights bodies, then what real consequences would a partner like India have if it continues to stave off human rights reports or critical statements on the human rights situation in India? I think that is also a sort of gray area that we need to look deeper into. But before we do that, Shubhangi, do you have any comments on this? On particularly if the criticism that India has been receiving from UN bodies, or let's say the US IRF, does that have any real consequences on India's position within the global world order?
I agree with you. I think that the EU is the only place where I see a significant sort of a diplomatic pushback, because it has maintained a strong focus on human rights, and human rights clauses also occupy a prominent place in EU bilateral negotiations.
Right.
But at the same time, like if I can pose a counter question, is that whether it how much importance do we want to place upon human rights groups and their reports? And I'll tell you why also. Because on one hand, the criticism of human rights is not only coming from authoritarian regimes, but also coming from people who believe that human rights promotes a particular way, and a particularly European way of the world, and has a particular notion of progress which states in the global south can never match up to. And I think this criticism has also been leveled at, say, Amnesty International by countries such as Nigeria or Turkey. So I think the question then becomes that how much reliance should we place upon human rights, and knowing that human rights is a flawed system, what do we do about it? But again, like a counterfactual to that would be marginalized communities in India have limited recourses to take. And I'm not entirely sure, which is why I would love to hear the both of your thoughts on this. When you any marginalized community will fight with the tools they have available, right? And just because they're using a tool doesn't necessarily mean that they believe in it. or that they legitimate it. Instead, it might be a question of just finding power in the pockets where it exists. So, what do you guys think about human rights uh, as a tool that's being used against uh, right-wing institutions? How much reliance we should be placing upon it?
I think human rights, the concept of human rights in the post-colonial sense, I think it certainly carries some kind of a loaded subtext, which may be seen almost like a neo-colonial sort of imposition from the global north into the global south. And I think we have seen a lot of countries in the global south make similar arguments against institutions like Amnesty and HRW. I particularly follow Myanmar very closely, and I have seen actually it's very the kind of arguments that Myanmar has been making against international human rights regimes, and the kind of arguments that the Modi government has been making, they are uncannily similar to each other. The way they dismiss UN reports or the Amnesty reports or Human Rights Watch reports, the language through which they do that, it's very much similar. So I think there is certainly a complexity built into the idea and the very idea of human rights. And I actually found that, the statement that the Indian Home Minister Amit Shah made last year, where he talked about something called the Indian human rights, or, human rights in an Indian context, as if Indian human rights are different from universal human rights. As unsettling as that statement was, I found it very interesting in terms of how authoritarian or sectarian or nationalist regimes do not dismiss human rights, but they reframe human rights within their own understanding. Something within their own understanding, or in a way that serves their own sectarian interests, so to say. So I think it becomes very easy for regimes to dismiss human rights. But I constantly again think back to Myanmar as to where is this trajectory going. Right now we are seeing human rights bodies like Amnesty or USCIRF, beyond the UN bodies of course, condemn India for sectarianism, for anti-minority assaults and everything. But those are limited to just statements. There is no hardcore action, or there is no concrete tangible response that we are seeing from any quarter. This was the case in Myanmar for the longest time with the Rohingya crisis. There was some intermittent noise made by the international community, but nothing happened until the case was brought at the International Court of Justice by the Gambia, right? And then we saw some tangible action being taken. So I try to juxtapose that in the Indian situation and try to think whether this is what we are looking at, if not the near but the distant future, where statements ultimately transform into some concrete framework of legal accountability within the international legal system. Right. So, but Pranav, how do you look at this situation?
So I have a common response to all of your concerns and questions in this case, and I think that is domestic politics. The domestic politics in Europe, in US, and in India will collectively determine the sort of institutional buy-in and importance of human rights as we understand them right now in terms of UDHR, ICCPR, and all. And also the sort of pushback that they're going to face. I think if the critical mass of pushback from authoritarian regimes grows, and we have a Trump re-election in the US, and we have a lot of these right-wing parties, some of those which are invited to Kashmir to visit Srinagar, if that sort of assortment emerges and there's a new authoritarian legal international order, then we can certainly see human rights as a concept getting affected, and in that situation, India getting by very easily, and maybe in terms of being on the commanding heights of such a formulation. But I think that is a very unlikely situation. I think currently, as we look at a regime change in the US, the sort of disquiet in the US Democratic Party about India is a lot. And we also know that a lot of Islamic countries have been quite enraged about recent events, not the least about the Tablighi Jamaat arrests that happened and the sort of the long-term detention that followed. So I think that the situation will become slightly unsustainable for India, where this double speak will become difficult. And I think the ideological aversion to human rights cannot sustain India's core national interest for too long. So at some time, India will have to become more accountable to the various groups of power of diplomatic powers that are trying to hold India accountable. Now that it becomes a question of which side the critical mass would be, but I see the critical mass going towards the side where more accountability is sought for. I think one more factor that we need to think about is the state of South Asia, or the sort of state of Kashmir Valley. So what will happen there? Because the moment something untoward happens, the sort of scrutiny of Indian policy would increase, and I I don't know how the situation there will pan out. I think it will also depend on how the situation in Pakistan domestically would pan out. So I think these are a lot of related things, and will depend on the sort of changes in domestic politics, in my opinion.
Right. I also, again, in thinking about whether India in the future, if the trajectory continues in this manner, that whether India will face any real action at any international level or any international body. Again, I'm going back to the Myanmar example because it's a brilliant case study of what happens when a country keeps flouting international human rights norms and principles and doesn't face consequences. Right? For the longest time, China was one country which has defended Myanmar consistently at United Nations Security Council. So whenever there has been a resolution against Myanmar, China has vetoed it down. But think about India. We do not have such a all-weather partner, especially within the P5. Within the UN Security Council, of course, the Western Bloc is, quote unquote, a friendly partner to India. But as we have discussed, that link is also faltering, right? So we do not have an assurance. We do not have a, endearing or year-long assurance that there is someone who's going to defend her at the UN Security Council if push comes to shove in the future, right? So that is also something that we've got to think about. Shubhangi, I want to put this question to you, particularly since you work on international law. So India, for instance, is a state party to a whole lot of international treaties, and it's not a state party to a other whole lot of international treaties, right? For instance, India is a state party to the ICCPR, right? But India is not a state party to the Refugee Convention, for instance. So those two things have been playing out differently. There can be an argument that can be made based on the ICCPR that the arbitrary arrests that have been made, that are being made against political dissidents or political activists, and particularly from minority groups, especially Muslims, that it somewhere violates the ICCPR. We could also argue at some level that the detention centers in existence in Assam, for instance, violates principles of arbitrary detention, no prolonged arbitrary detention. So those arguments can be made. At the same time, since India is not a state party to the Refugee Convention, there is an argument that is made that India can legitimately not take in refugees or send back refugees or refoul refugees. India has in fact refouled at least 7 Rohingya refugees in the past 2 years, at least, from India back to Myanmar. India, of course, calls it legitimate deportation. But then again, there is a question that the principle of non-refoulement is a part of customary international law. That you do not need to sign the Genocide Convention for you to not refoul refugees, right? My question to you is that, given the situation at home right now, how do you see international legal regimes interacting with India, like or affecting India, or let's say India's actions falling within the ambit of international legal laws, including those conventions that India has signed and not signed, and the third being customary international law?
Okay, so with regard to the ICCPR first, I think it's crucial to remember that even if India is a signatory to the ICCPR, the municipal legal framework is still dualist in nature. What this means is that unlike some countries where international law can be considered a part of the law of the land, even without transformation to national law, the same does not happen in India. Under Article 253 of the Indian Constitution, the Parliament has the power to enact a law to implement a treaty. And what this means is that international law does not become binding under the Indian Constitution until an appropriate domestic legislation is enacted to give effect to it. So what this means is, even now, if there's a violation of rights under the ICCPR, it would be unactionable without a specific statute implementing those rights. And India has also very conveniently made reservations to Article 13 of the ICCPR, which deals with the rights of aliens, and which would allow and which now allows it to apply its municipal law to foreigners without any interference. Then like the other possible remedies that would have existed also seem doubtful, because India has also refused to ratify the first optional protocol to the ICCPR, which would have enabled an individual complaint mechanism. Um, so this means that the ICCPR violations are non-justiciable at the international level. Of course, like you give the example of Myanmar, so the International Court of Justice can also address some violations. In particular, ICCPR violations, which it had done in a previous case, which is the advisory opinion on the wall, but it cannot investigate sovereign acts of states from its own accord without the same being disputed by one or more states. So I think that's a very that leaves us with in a very dismal situation, to say the least, because like practically there, even if India, just because India is a signatory to a treaty, does not necessarily mean that there will be legal consequences if it violates the treaty, right? With regard to like the UN Convention on Refugees, you're absolutely correct. It hasn't signed the protocol either, and it doesn't even have a domestic legal framework for refugees. But what is interesting is that despite not having this, India has traditionally adhered to the policy of non-refoulement. Uh, so the case of Rohingyas actually marks a shift in India's stand on the principle of non-refoulement, uh, which I would say like not only arises out of rising Hindu nationalism, but also other competing interests that India has in the region. For example, like the competition with China and India's economic interests and ambitions in Myanmar, and the fragile geopolitics of India's northeast, where India constantly fears that there'll be an insurgency movement. So I think all in all, the ad hoc refugee policy and the very strategic legal ambiguity that exists uh, allows India to differentiate between different groups in its treatment towards refugees and put other interests over humanitarian concerns, so to speak.
Right. Pranav, I want to come to you with this. I think we briefly referred to this earlier, that we somewhere understand the Western Bloc criticizing India for human rights violations, for pushbacks to its liberal democratic order. But this time we saw something unique earlier this year. We saw some criticism coming from a very unusual quarter, which is the Gulf. Where we saw some very strong statements made on social media by influential users, social media users from the Gulf, including Kuwait, Qatar, if I'm not wrong, and Bahrain. After a controversial and explicitly worded tweet by a BJP legislator, Tejashwi Surya from Bangalore, emerged on social media. And we immediately saw this extreme reaction from the Gulf about rising Islamophobia in India. Although a lot of them sort of corrected their statements later and retracted their statements, there was also a letter which was written to the Kuwaiti Parliament from one of the legislators, which was leaked later, which is condemning India for rising Islamophobia. So, but India traditionally has had a very healthy relationship with West Asia, with the Gulf particularly, and not just the Gulf, with North African countries like Egypt. When Nehru was highly admired by those countries in the immediate post-colonial sense, right? So, but this time we saw those countries speak up against India, and I think it rattled the establishment in New Delhi to a large extent. We saw Jaishankar reaching out through back channels to them to those countries to assure them that this won't happen. I think our ambassador in the United Arab Emirates also made a statement on Twitter where it actually asked Indian expats in the UAE to adhere to quote-unquote mutual principles of tolerance, inclusion, democracy, and all of that, right? So what do you say? Can you give us a bit of a historical context, if you want, as to how this sudden shift has emerged?
I think the problem is that when you start something and you lose control of it. So if the Prime Minister starts a redefinition of the Indian nationhood and Indian citizenship, wherein it is Hindu majoritarian, and that Hindu majoritarian has the prejudice as well as aversion towards Muslim and everything Islamic as its central credo, then you don't know where you can stop. So I remember that when the ambassador to I don't know the exact name, I think maybe the ambassador to Saudi Arabia, he mentioned secularism in his response to the Indian expats there, saying that you are living in another country, you are, and that we come from a country which is secular.
Yeah, I think that was the Indian ambassador to the UAE.
Yes, UAE. Yes, sorry. So he did talk about non-discrimination. So I think that is the problem that we are at. So and that is what is driving our confusion to a great extent, because this redefinition project of Indian nationhood that is going on at one time is it completely at odds with the traditionally espoused national interest, and that the national interest was very smartly, deftly made during the Nehruvian era of foreign policy. Senior journalist Saeed Naqvi, in his book Being the Other, has explained in great detail how Nehru ensured that some Indian Muslim intellectuals and diplomats were stationed abroad in these Gulf countries explicitly, like there was an explicit outreach to Islam, and India did not shy away from its Islamic heritage, culture. And we did see even Modi government try to participate in the OIC meetings. But even the relationship with the Organization of Islamic Countries has gone sour after the situation in Kashmir. So I do see that the current government acknowledges that the policies of the Nehruvian foreign policy establishment did make strategic sense for India, which is why they course correct whenever something like this happens. But that does not mean that they actually change or stop their strident project for redefinition of the Indian nationhood. So this decoupling is unsustainable, and there will have to come a time where non-discrimination as an idea has to be practiced both at home and abroad. So the dog whistling of Muslims, etc., done by top leaders, will have to stop in India as well. Otherwise, you cannot expect your expats abroad to not follow your example. So right. I think that's the sort of situation we are in, and it's a very confusing situation.
This again, I think this comes back to what we were discussing earlier, that there's a sort of double speak in India's attitude, right? Where at home where the government is targeting Muslims, but it has very good relations and very good sort of geostrategic understandings and agreements with Muslim majority countries in the Gulf like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, etc. But again, it's true what you said, that even if there are good relationships between New Delhi and let's say Riyadh, or New Delhi and Abu Dhabi, the point is that if there is an escalating rhetoric against Indian Muslims, then it will become difficult for governments in Muslim majority countries like those to continue good relations with India. Even if they want to, in a very real politics sense, even if they want to, there will be pressure at home in their own countries, from their own constituencies, to review the relationship with India. I think we are seeing a lot of this in the India-Bangladesh bilateral also, where Dhaka for the longest time has tried to stay neutral, and in fact toe the line that Delhi was towing on NRC, that this is an internal issue, right? So, and Dhaka had agreed that this is an internal issue, but we see complaints, and we see certain pushbacks or headwinds rather coming in from Dhaka. Because of the very fact that more and more people in Bangladesh, a Muslim majority country, has started speaking out against legislations like the CAA, the NRC, and the Modi government's ostensible anti-Muslim assaults, right? So I think this will come to head at some point. Okay, this is my last question, and I have to ask this, now that we have a Joe Biden administration, an incoming Biden administration in the White House, which supposedly is going to be very different from a Trump presidency, right? How do you think India's image will come about to be in the eyes of the United States? Will there be a shift at all? Or will the Modi government, suffer in any way because of the exit of an administration which was more or less expressly sympathetic towards the kind of governance that Narendra Modi was practicing at home?
So I think, At this stage, it's hard to say how a potential Biden presidency will pursue foreign policy. I mean, obviously, Biden was the vice president and he has taken certain vocal positions on foreign policy over the years. So we do have some things to draw upon. And in my opinion, like, I think that he'd take a very mainstream view in the sense that he would be an advocate for strong American leadership and exceptionalism on the world stage, but frequently like less hawkish than others, including the president, the incumbent government of the United States. So, just to give you an example, I think Biden had voted for the Iraq war, but then he's also voted against bombing in Syria and against intervention in Libya thereafter. But at the same time, Biden doesn't come across as someone who'd be interested in defense cuts. And what I thought was particularly alarming for from the positionality of the global South, when you're looking at Biden's foreign policy, is that when he during Obama's presidency, he had what we call in international relations parlance a light footprint approach to terrorism. So he advocated for drones and rapid deployment to conduct borderless strike strategies against terrorist groups all over the world. And I think that presents some problems. To most countries of the global south, including India. So I think the Democrats have always claimed that they adhere to a value based foreign policy, but the facts on ground have often been very different. However, with regard to India in particular, I think there has been like there's something going on in the Democratic Party, which we also saw in the primaries, where there was an effort by at least the younger members of the Democratic Party um, to make foreign policy an issue, to really reevaluate the way America conducts itself in the world and make it a salient political move. So I think the question then becomes, will Biden be pressurized by the younger members of the Democratic Party to move in that direction? That being said, I'm not really sure whether India will be a priority in the near future because the United States, much like the rest of the world, is in a massive political crisis that I don't see ending anytime soon. I think like very recently Biden had put up his transition plans on his website, and he lists four clear plans including the COVID crisis, racial inequality, economic security, and climate change. So, and these are all like very domestic issues, and I think it'll definitely be a while before something like Kashmir is even on the US radar.
Right, right. There is definitely some sense in the fact that while the Democratic Party has always postured liberally when it comes to doing foreign policy or diplomacy in the real world, it has taken a very realist approach, a very realpolitik approach. But there is also the fact that the Democratic Party has this progressive left wing made up of people like Alexandria Ocasio Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and even Pramila Jayapal, who tried to meet our Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar when he visited the United States sometime back, but was refused audience, which actually attracted some bad press and negative attention from people like Alexandria Ocasio Cortez, right, who stood behind Pramila Jayapal. So there is this progressive left wing within the Democratic Party, which would have more human rights or accountability oriented approaches in its foreign policy. And to a certain degree, Bernie Sanders is the pack leader of this pack, right? I know there is some grave friction between this particular left wing within the Democrats and the more centrist moderate left wing, centrist moderate Democrats like Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton. But still, the existence of this particular wing and the future of this wing in American politics cannot be discounted. On top of that, what the Modi government did vis-a-vis the Trump administration was behave in a particularly partisan manner, right? By doing events such as Howdy Modi and going on stage in the United States and saying "Ab ki baar Trump Sarkar" or this time Trump Sarkar again. I think Modi created a kind of friction between himself and the political opposition to Trump, which most prominently the Democratic Party. And now that we have a Democrat president, do you think that's going to matter? Do you think all of this is going to matter now, Pranav?
So I think, Angshuman, as has been discussed in the past in the commentary that has been around this issue, the India's issues will certainly be addressed more patiently in terms of trade and even military support and the sort of international alliance building uh, that that Biden looks to make. And especially in dealing with China, we will have the aid of more level-headed thinking. But I think your question is more related to the sort of relationship of the strongman, the national leader, Narendra Modi, and his regime with the regime in US. And I think with regards to that, it's important. It will really depend upon the sort of influence that the progressive caucus in the Democratic Party will have. And as it appears, they're not going to get any positions in the Biden administration, and they will continue to remain like a fringe group. And if not a fringe group, then having very non-substantial say in the sort of power politics. I agree that the sort of partisanship that Modi had displayed and a lot of BJP supporters in India had displayed towards Trump's party will make things slightly awkward. But I think because these are a matter of state and both are diplomats, they will this awkwardness won't be a big issue. The biggest issue will be on the breaches of minority rights, because those will be highlighted by global media. They will become matters that institutionally the US institutions, etc., will take up. And how does the US president deal with them? I think the US president will not shut them out or not listen to them. We will have more opportunities for the government to become transparent or have a conversation. So the sort of shutting off of dissenting voices, the foreign dissenting voices, is less likely to happen, I guess. But I think overall, Biden's overall record doesn't seem to be a very human rights defending record, and he seems to be like a run-of-the-mill white democratic leader who has done a lot of things. And so I don't think there'll be a very principled stand that he will take against breaches of minority rights, etc. But certain factors like the prominence of the progressive caucus and all will really play a role. And I think that there will be a change, but it will not be substantial, as has been argued.
All right. Thanks, both of you, for sparing, I would say, more than an hour now for this particular episode. We've covered a lot of ground, and there's a lot of things happening, and this is a vast topic. So I'm glad we spoke so much. I think this is the longest episode I've recorded so far, and I think it's going to be worth it. Once again, thank you both for taking out time and joining me on this show.
Thank you, Angshuman. It was a real pleasure to speak to you and Shubhangi.
Thank you for having us.